Okay, so in this part of the lecture I'm just going to go through one case study, and the case study I've chosen is a piece of research by Brush Saye on a project they did using multimedia work to support problem-based inquiry in a history project. And the history context they were working in was looking at the American Civil Rights Movement. So I'm going to just kind of work through their rationale and then just reflect a little bit on how we might link this to your own practice, and I'll draw that out in particular in part 3 of the lecture. So they start off in this published research article with a very clear focus. They're interested in PBL, or problem-based learning, and they're interested in particular in how this relates to history. But in relating it to history, they try to be specific, and they talk about the fact that the controversial nature of historical problems necessitates the kind of reasoning that is different from using PBL, problem-based learning, in other contexts. So if you use it in maths or in logic, then that's absolutely fine. But in history, we have to acknowledge that most of the problems that we're going to be dealing with are kind of open, ethical, moral, complicated problems. So they said, when they have looked at the literature for how people approach historical problems, they found that the novice problem solver, i.e. the post-primary student or learner, tends to focus on the two-dimensional, the surface or superficial features of an issue, whereas the expert, the history teacher or the history graduate, incorporates a slightly more abstract third dimension, or brings broader conceptual structures that help them to organise and analyse the data in order to reason through a problem. This is what we were talking about in the long lectures. This is what the kind of conceptual framework might be that an expert history learner would bring that a novice might not bring. So therefore, these researchers recognise that that kind of reasoning requires something particular, and what it requires is a sustained engagement with a problem, and we can't do real in-depth problem solving through quick individual tasks. So they recognise, therefore, that if we're going to get teenagers to focus for sustained periods on single problems, that we also have to really think about how we're going to engage the students' interest, because we can't take it for granted that children will be interested over several weeks. So they think the thing that history can offer us is authentic tasks, which are likely to be open and complicated, to require some abstract reasoning to engage with them, but also sufficiently interesting to draw students in to make them want to focus for an extended period of time. They also recognise that to fully grasp the complexity of a situation, students have to understand that there are competing perspectives to interpret that situation, and that they link explicitly to the literature on historical empathy. So here the authors engage with much of the material that we were discussing in the long lecture on historical empathy. They talk about the need to develop a good factual grasp of the context, in order to develop the ability to see different perspectives and the opportunity to demonstrate that students care about the issue being studied. So here they're talking about the fact that there are two strands to historical empathy in the literature. The one is understanding different perspectives in context, and the second is demonstrating some kind of emotional empathy for the people who are living in that situation. And then finally, in setting up their research, the authors recognise that's influenced by the student's own conceptual understanding of what history is. Is it a straightforward narrative to be recounted and learned? History is just the same as what happened in the past, or is it a more complex and conditional account which has been constructed by different people from different perspectives, making the best sense they can with the evidence available to them? And so they link that to the ongoing discussion that we started in the long lecture 1 on students' sense of what kind of a thing history is. So when they pull this together, they frame this as a piece of action research. They say they want to determine whether their multimedia program supports problem-based inquiry and encourages that deep engagement with an historical problem. That's their first challenge. The second challenge is to determine whether doing that facilitates students' development of historical empathy and their epistemology in the sense of their understanding of competing perspectives. And then thirdly, they're interested in exploring how structured activities and scaffolds can help children build up this more sophisticated sense of history. So you can see that this is, in a sense, this is their teaching plan. It has 3 distinctive learning intentions, but they are also framing this as a piece of research, and they will collect evidence to feed back into their decision-making process about the extent to which they were successful. So this is their intervention. They developed a multimedia resource called Decision Point. It included lots of content relating to the American Civil Rights Movement. It was organised into these 3 categories: legal challenges, non-violent protest and black power. And then they also included a whole range of scaffolds or scaffolded activities for students to use. So they had some interactive essays, and you could click through from the text to further information. They had student guides to help the students organise their notes and look for key issues as they were reading through sources of information and watching videos. They had a storyboard template to help the students organise their thinking as they collected more data, and a tool to help them present their findings. And the problem they chose, in terms of being an authentic challenge, was one that was a genuine problem that people in the civil rights movement confronted. And it was a situation which was, or a problem rather, that was ongoing and around which people clustered with different ideas about how to solve it. So this was the briefing for the students in class, taking the roles of consultants to the civil rights movement, devise some advice on what strategies the movement should adopt in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination in order to continue the struggle for a more just, equal society. And then working in groups, the students had to devise a strategy and present the strategy with a justification. So here's an overview of the project. This would be, if you like, an overview of a scheme of work. The first phase is collecting data. Second is working through that, synthesizing it and thinking about what you're going to do with it. The third is constructing a case to support your thoughts on what the civil rights movement should do, and then you get a chance to defend that and to open yourself up to questions. So they collected data to help them reflect on the extent to which they were being successful. They conducted classroom observations. When they were doing observations, they were asking themselves this question: how did the students engage with the resources? So were these problems sufficiently engaging? Did they sustain children's engagement and interest? And what kind of questions did the children ask? So do the questions they ask of the teacher and of each other indicate really deep thinking about the nature of the problem and the nature of the evidence they had? They also had the student presentations as another source of evidence. And when they were looking at the presentations, they were thinking about to what extent did the presentations actually demonstrate the desired characteristics of higher level historical reasoning and empathy. Thirdly, after the learning was completed, they then interviewed students about the process, and they just wanted to find out what advice they would give to teachers for improving this project. And then finally, because these researchers came in from a university, they weren't the teachers themselves, they interviewed the teachers. For us in the classroom, this fourth stage would just be a personal reflection, or keeping a journal of our experiences as we went through the scheme of work. But they had to make some judgments about the extent to which they were being successful, and so these were their criteria. The first one was engagement, and they wanted to have some measure of engagement, and so they assessed that according to the observations they made, and they asked themselves simply, do they think the children demonstrated a level of interest? Do they think they showed a level of diligence? And here the idea is that if you try hard and you sustain your effort on a piece of work, that's a reflection of the fact that you're engaged in it. You don't get sloppy, your enthusiasm doesn't kind of disappear as you come back to the same piece of work. And then just observing the level of participation. Are all students on task? Are they all talking to each other about the work? The second thing we said they were looking for was historical empathy. And so here the criteria for judgments was whether the students were willing to make emotional connections and to consider the human experiences of people in the human rights movement. So were they looking at this as a purely academic enterprise, or were they able to see that people had different views because they had different experiences, because they had different emotional experiences? And then finally, they wanted to get some handle on how children's sense of history itself as a discipline was developing, and they used from the literature this model of absolutist, multiplist or evaluative historical epistemology. In other words, do you just believe there's one history which is correct and all other versions are wrong? That's the absolutist version. The multiplist, which is people just make up their own versions of history, and it depends on what your preference is. And the evaluative, which is there are different accounts of history, different interpretations, but that's not just down to personal preference. We can test those according to the rules by which we use evidence and construct causal explanations. So they were able to draw some conclusions about the level of engagement in the classroom, and through reflecting on their observations of the children, they said they observed sustained conversations over time. They said that students' self-reported levels of enjoyment and interest in the task were high, and they said that students were challenging others' interpretations during the presentations, and that showed a level of interest and enthusiasm and engagement, a kind of buy-in to the task, if you like, that showed they were really engaged. When they came to say something about the extent to which they'd achieved empathy, they said that there was evidence in the class observations of exploring different perspectives, and they gave examples of children's conversations that they'd recorded. They said there was also evidence of emotional commitment in role-based discussions. So examples they gave were white middle-class students identifying with different groups in the black civil rights movement. And then finally, when they talked to students afterwards, they said students reported themselves that they had an improved understanding of the living conditions and experiences that gave rise to those historical actions. When it came to epistemology, they said some students still maintained a belief in that single, simple account, but they acknowledged that there were different perceptions of the actual truth. So their own epistemological stance only shifted slightly. Others demonstrated a more sophisticated stance, and for example, one student said to the researchers, historians say, the Great Depression was caused by the fall of the stock market, but who knows whether it's the stock market or not? That's what makes history so funny. You don't know nothing till you break it down, so in the end it's going to be somebody's opinion. But this student isn't just saying it's someone's opinion so I can't ever question them. They're recognising this comes down to interpretation and constructing a causal argument, and you can test the validity or plausibility of that historical argument. So whilst they were saying that there was still lots of people who were stuck with a fairly basic historical epistemology, there was some evidence that other people were being challenged, and some evidence that some students were moving into a more sophisticated understanding. So by way of conclusions, if we think about that action research cycle, how might we close the first loop and think about the challenge for the second loop? They said that some of the student work was ultimately disappointing. They were very engaged, they were interested, they were motivated, but the quality of work wasn't what they were hoping for. So one of their conclusions in terms of a very practical teaching improvement was more scaffolds to help the children really explicitly focus on how to construct an argument from the evidence. And they were also saying maybe the problem they were set about what advice to give the civil rights movement was too big, too vague, too expansive, and maybe more specific problems would be helpful from a pedagogical perspective. And the second conclusion was about how would you move more of the children towards a more advanced and sophisticated epistemological stance about the nature of history. And here they were saying maybe more deliberate use of hyperlinks within the interactive essays so that students are constantly seeing juxtaposed accounts, so that they're constantly having this single narrative challenged by leading you to different accounts. Whenever you meet a single account, you are given another one and given the opportunity to test them against each other. And they were also talking about changing the instructions for the presentation task so that students had to focus more explicitly on evaluating the strengths of theirs and others' arguments, so that they really move into this zone, not just to presenting an interpretation, but testing it against established historical criteria. So the final thing to say about this kind of research really is that it has a clear purpose, which positions it in action research, I think, that it is to identify actions for further refinement of the teaching. This is not to come up with any huge innovation in theory, but it is to say if you want your children to engage in learning historical empathy and problem solving, and therefore develop a more advanced epistemological view of what history is as a discipline, then you need to build that into your activities. You need to evaluate the extent to which those activities achieve that, and then you need to devise some newer teaching interventions or refine your teaching ideas in order to move students on in those specific ways. So that's linked to ongoing discussions in the literature about historical thinking, but always clearly comes back to focus on not making another contribution to the literature, but on thinking about how we use the literature to move our practice on. So that's what I wanted to say about this example, and in the third part of the lecture we'll move on and say something about what does all of this mean for your practice.